This lesson covers the components that make up a group policy object. A group policy object consists of a computer configuration and a user configuration. And within each of these there are policies and there are preferences. Policies are really broken up into a number of areas. We have software settings that enable us to actually deploy software, and also Windows settings that have components such as startup and shutdown scripts for a computer, security settings that will actually match the same settings that were available on the local security policy of a machine. For example, those account policies, the password policy, account lockout policy, and these are actually configured by default. There are a number of built-in group policy objects. If I go back and look at group policy management, you'll see a default domain policy. And the settings of that policy actually set things such as the password policy, default password history, maximum password age, password length, complexity, lockout settings. So that's going to be enabled by default on your domain. Likewise, there is a default domain controllers policy to really restrict who can, for example, log on to a domain controller. You don't want everyone in the domain logging onto your domain controllers, so it really restricts who is allowed to interactively log on with your domain controllers in addition to other configurations and various other policies. There's then the administrative template section. Likewise, if I look at a user, you're going to see much of the same options, except under Windows settings, you're now going to see things for log on, log off instead of machine startup shutdown. You're going to see options related to folder redirection. For example, your My Documents, My Pictures, Music. They are user settings that aren't available for a computer. So those could be redirected to a file server, for example. All of these administrative templates are actually defined in ADMX files. If you look at your machine, under C, Windows, you'll see a policy definitions. And this contains all of the ADMX files that make up all the available settings. Now these are language independent. If you were to open these up, they actually then relate to a number of language files which have the language specific text for each of the various group policies defined in these XML based files. Now while we do have a local set of ADMX files on each machine, that would be a very inconsistent experience. For example, if I was logging on and managing group policy from a Windows 2012 machine, and then went to edit the same group policy from maybe Windows Server 2008 R2, these ADMX files would be different and I would be missing some settings. The recommendation is therefore to create a central store. Literally take all of the files from the policy definitions file of the newest operating system, create a folder called policy definitions under the policies folder of your domain under sysvol, and copy all those files to it. Your group policy editing software will then automatically see this and use it. I can see this because if I hover over administrative templates, it's telling me it's actually using it from the central store. And there are literally thousands of different settings available to me here. Pretty much everything you can think of can be defined through these administrative templates. To make it easy, you can search group policy, but Microsoft also maintain an XLS spreadsheet that you can download for the different versions of Windows. For example, each new version introduces new group policy settings. So you can download this spreadsheet. I, for example, have already downloaded the 2012 Windows 8 version, and you can now scroll through all the different settings available. As you can see, there are nearly 3,500 of them. And it's actually telling you the policy path where this is actually being stored. And this is an important part. These are managed settings. So managed settings set by these ADMX files mean that if this group policy is then deleted, i.e. not applied anymore, the changes made will actually be undone from those machines. It's not tattooing the machine, i.e. making it permanent. Additionally, these managed settings mean if there is an option to configure this within a user interface, it would actually be disabled. An unmanaged setting would not be removed from the machine should that group policy object be deleted or unlinked from that organizational unit, domain, or site. If you created your own ADMX files and you're writing to non-standard locations that aren't standard policies, you're going to end up tattooing that machine And should you want to remove that policy, you're going to have to take some steps to manually undelete those changes. The good news is, as I look around my various group policy settings, there's a lot of built-in help now. For example, I say I want to hide specific control panel items. It's telling me the versions of Windows that this policy will work for, and actually gives me details about what this is going to do. If I open one of these up, and I now have to say it's enabled, and I can now say these are the ones I actually want to disable, and it's giving me examples of the values I could actually use in here. I'll now set that back to not configured. Likewise, if I look at desktop, for example, I can say I want to hide certain icons from the desktop, so I'm going to remove the computer icon. It's giving me details about all of those various changes that I'm going to make. So it makes it very easy to know what I'm changing. It's still going to be fairly intimidating when you first go to create a group policy object, but really the scope of what you can do is huge. For example, if I look at some of the example group policy objects I've created, I run a logon script. So this is applied to the user portion, and all I do is I run this script. So this is actually a great place to go. I can go to my settings and actually see how I'm doing these group policies. I might actually want to block, for example, software running. So I have a block applications, and there's really two ways to block applications. There are software restriction policies, which are available in all versions of Windows, and then there is App Locker, which is available in the Enterprise Edition and above. So if I actually open up this group policy object, I have the software restriction policies. Now by default it will create some rules for you, and then I created an additional rule. I said do not allow notepad.exe to run, but you can create rules based on a path, i.e. an exact executable or located in a certain folder. I can base it on which network zone this software originated from, i.e. Internet Explorer, was it a trusted and untrusted internal? Is the software signed? A hash based on the executable of a program. To stop you being able to just rename the exe, the hash actually creates this unique value based on the exe. And it then blocks that. So for example, if I go to this machine and try and run Notepad, it's been blocked by group policy. This is fairly heavy-handed. The other option is to use App Locker. And the goal of App Locker is really you want to try and block everything and then just enable specific applications. Maybe they're signed. It's just an easier environment to use. For example, here I denied calculator to everyone, but there are default rules that allow everything, but I could change this. I could say block everything except the ones that I create allow rules for. I have drive mappings. So you notice here I'm actually using a preference. So this was a new feature added in the recent versions of Windows. Whereas a policy is enforced at all times, the user can't override it, and I'm setting these really registry-based values. The goal of a preference is to set an initial value for a configuration, but not necessarily enforce it. And it's not going to constantly be refreshed, although you can change that behavior. I edit this group policy object, look at preferences, and here I can see some of the different options available to me. So where in the past I may have used logon scripts, for example, to map drives, here I can use a preference, and you can see I'm actually using a preference here to map a drive. I'm going to map the S drive to this particular path on all the machines in my domain. Likewise, I can map printers. I can handle configuration of folders, of devices, power options. And this actually looks like the control panel applet. I can go and set these options in a far more friendly interface. It also has this Common tab. So the Common tab allows me to set some more advanced options on the application of this preference. So I can say remove this when it's no longer applied. So actually undo this setting. Apply it once but do not reapply. So this is giving me an initial configuration, but the user can then change it. I can do item level targeting. So in the past I talked about maybe security, I talked about WMI filters. Targeting allows me to do very sophisticated sets of checks. So for example, I can check things like, does the CPU speed meet a certain criteria? Is there a certain amount of disk space available? Is the MAC address of the machine in a certain range? All these different types of options can be used to target if this preference is actually applied or not. If you are using logon scripts today, I'd urge you to really take a step back, look at what you're doing in those logon scripts, which can be very cumbersome and complex, and the chances are you can probably use preferences to override a lot of those things you're performing. A particular favorite of mine is restricted groups. So the goal of this is, perhaps I want a certain group of users to always be a member of the local admins group of a group of machines. Maybe today I did that via a logon script. Maybe I just make everyone a domain admin. The goal of restricted groups is it allows me to actually create a rule to say for a specific group, I'll just say all of them, on a machine, always make sure these people are in that group, and it will stop anyone else being added to the group. When this is applied, automatically these users will now be made members of this group on all the machines this applies to. So if I had a group of servers in a particular organizational unit, I could apply this policy to that organizational unit and instantly populate those groups with the people I need to be in there. Likewise, I can add this group to a member of other groups. So this is a very powerful setting. Ultimately, really any aspect you have of your environment you can configure through group policy objects. Have a look at the spreadsheet, have a look around, have a look at preferences, even firewall, for example, here. I enabled a group policy object to make sure I could always deploy the configuration manager client to all of my machines by opening a certain firewall exception. Really utilize group policy objects. You can avoid the use of scripts, lock down your environment, and make sure it's secure. This concludes the lesson on editing group policy objects.